This is episode 266 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Kathleen Sgamma. She is the president of the Western Energy Alliance, a voice of the oil and gas industry here in the West, which includes, of course, the third largest oil producing state in the nation, New Mexico. Welcome to the podcast, Kathleen.
Thanks for having me on, Paul. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, well, obviously here we are in early January. There's a lot of ground shifting going on right now in politics, both at the state level, but at the national level as well. And, before we get into some of the nitty-gritty issues, talk a little bit about the Energy Alliance and what it really does with the oil producing states of the American West.
So Western Energy Alliance is a trade association that represents oil and natural gas producers in New Mexico and all across the West. We represent companies on federal issues, and because so much of the West, like New Mexico, contains federal public lands, we are the tip of the spear when it comes to public lands issues for the industry. So we represent companies associated with the upstream portion of the industry, so at the wellhead, basically.
Nice. And, we'll talk about, the presidential situation and changes there. But give us an idea of how oil and gas impacts the economy of various states, including New Mexico. And, I understand this is a rapid changing situation given what happened with COVID-19 in oil prices in the past year. But kind of talk about 30,000 feet, how big of a deal is oil and gas in some of these states, especially New Mexico?
Well, in New Mexico, oil and natural gas is a major part of your economy. It provides about a third of the budget for the state. And so it's an important employer and it's an important industry in New Mexico, as much as some in Santa Fe and Albuquerque would like to disown us. Across the West, we've got other major oil and natural gas states like New Mexico, including Wyoming, North Dakota, Colorado, for example, and then other states like Utah and Montana, where oil and natural gas is very important as well. So we employ hundreds of thousands of employees directly and indirectly across the Rocky Mountain West. And we're a major part of job creation and sustaining the economy, not to mention the energy needs of Americans in the West and all across the country.
Now, how would you quantify your region? And you've got states, well, it looks like your trade association includes everybody west of Minnesota, west of Iowa, not including Kansas, Oklahoma, or Texas, or California, but pretty much the rest of the West all fits in to your representation. Is Texas, Texas obviously is a big producer, as is Oklahoma. Are they just in a different, producing trade association from you, or they're
in a Texas different region? So okay. Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas are considered mid-continent. So the industry traditionally has been kind of looked at as mid-continent with those states, and then the Rocky Mountain West, which is what we represent. So your major oil and gas producing states are North Dakota, Montana, on south, down to New Mexico, including Utah. There is some oil and natural gas development in Nevada, Nebraska, South Dakota, and we do represent those states as well. And there was even some activity in Idaho when natural gas prices were higher. But, you know, those are the major producing states. And like you mentioned, New Mexico has just become, with the Permian Basin explosion, has become a major oil and natural gas state, even more than it was before.
Yeah. And one of the things, I guess, Texas is the biggest producing state in the nation, North Dakota second, and we're third. But, when you look at North Dakota and Texas, from the perspective of New Mexico here, they have a heck of a lot more in common than we do for one very specific region, which is federal land ownership. And kind of talk about the importance of that, because I think based on a Biden presidency and Deb Haaland, of course, from Albuquerque here as potentially Secretary of the Interior, those federal lands could be tremendously impacted.
That's right. And that's another reason that Western Energy Alliance exists as a trade association is, like I said, we're the tip of the spear when it comes to federal public lands issues for the industry. So you are correct. We as a country are probably very lucky that Texas does not have public lands. So there's only so much that a Biden administration can do to mess with Texas, right? They don't have that direct control on public lands because generally, even in New Mexico, the states regulate oil and natural gas. They regulate fracking. They regulate the well. They regulate air quality. So when it comes to federal lands, though, obviously the federal government has a lot more control. And states like New Mexico, where the resources predominantly on federal lands, as opposed to just across the border in Texas, where same Permian, same type of resource, same excellent oil resource, but they are just not going to have to deal with any of this federal lands issues, whereas New Mexico will. And so it really puts billions of dollars of state revenue and GDP and jobs at risk in New Mexico when President-elect Biden starts talking about banning federal leasing and permitting. North Dakota also is pretty affected by federal lands issues because the way we're developed now is we drill down about a mile and then we drill out a mile or two horizontally. And in North Dakota, you may have a well that sits on non-federal lands. Maybe it's a private landowner or maybe it's state lands, but that lateral might hit a pocket of federal minerals just because there's so much interlocking land ownership and mineral ownership in the West. That's just how the West, was settled, and how the government did under the Homesteading Act and such kept most of the minerals underneath the ground, even if the surface was given to private individuals under the Homesteading Acts. So in North Dakota, about a third of the wells end up touching some federal minerals. And when that happens, you have to get a federal lease, you have to get a federal permit, you have to do all the environmental analysis that you have to do if you're sitting on a federal surface and drilling a federal well. It, in a sense, becomes a federal well. So about a third of North Dakota wells are affected by federal process. And then, of course, most of the Permian development in New Mexico is also federal. I mean, you can try your hardest in the West, in, let's say, Wyoming or New Mexico, to develop just on non-federal lands, just on private surface, private minerals. But just because of the interlocking ownership of lands in the West, it's nearly impossible, especially now with these long horizontal laterals.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot of land in a lot of states, including New Mexico. And I know, depending on how you account for it, something on the order of 40 or so % of New Mexico is federally owned. And, some of that's tribal lands, some of that's White Sands Missile Range, et cetera. But a lot of New Mexico is owned by the federal government. And before we get on to a recent study that just came out showing how much some of the Biden administration or soon to be Biden administration's proposed policies could impact New Mexico. Uh, can you talk about specifically why the federal government is so difficult to deal with relative to state governments and whatnot? And of course, we had Obama, who was somewhat skeptical of oil and gas, and you could talk about real world experiences with that, versus President Trump, who was maybe the most favorable to oil and gas in terms of presidents that we've ever had. And Biden seems to be far to the left, at least his stated positions during the campaign were far to the left of even Obama. So, understanding that they have very, very different incentive structures in place at the federal level, how does the administration, each one, change those policies towards oil and gas?
Well, it's kind of like dealing with the IRS, right? It's kind of like dealing with a federal government agency. It's usually not that pleasant of a process because governments are big and bureaucratic and they move slowly. So there are a number of things that affect development on federal lands. First and foremost, I'll say, is that it's federally managed. It is owned by the American people. When we talk about federal public lands, they're in a sense owned by the American people. So the lands should be more protected and there should be more process on federal lands because the federal government is administering those lands in trust for the American people, right? And we have various competing interests on federal lands. Some are conservation only, some are for good rangeland. Some are used for oil and natural gas development. There are multi-purpose or what we call multi-use public lands, and those are managed for things like energy development and ranching. And then there are those public lands that are put away and for conservation only, and that's appropriate. Everything goes through a land use planning process. So there should be more process on federal lands than, say, on private surface where a private owner is not, wants to make sure their land is protected too, but it's not all the American people whose land we're talking about. But we also have to remember is that the energy underneath those federal lands are also owned by the American people. And the American people should have the ability to get that energy developed on their behalf, get paid a fair royalty for that development. And, so there's just more process on federal lands. The problem is sometimes that balance is out of whack. Certainly there's more process, but it shouldn't be so much process that you can't develop those federal lands at all. So what we saw, and we kind of see a tipping or a seesaw with various administrations, and it starts at the top. If a president like President Trump has this, what he called an energy dominance agenda, he recognized the importance of American energy from a strategic standpoint, from a job standpoint, from an economic opportunity standpoint, and just, simply meeting the needs and the energy needs of Americans without having to import that energy from overseas. So he, from the top, put an emphasis on oil and natural gas development. And so that leadership from the top on down really helps because then, there's more of a partnership between industry and the government on developing those lands. We, of course, develop them responsibly. We follow all environmental laws. We go above and beyond on federal lands. There's more process to protect that federal lands. There are more regulations on federal lands. And so, there's just more things you have to do on federal lands. But conversely, even with that top-down emphasis, there's still a lot of bureaucracy. So that, there are various layers of bureaucracy you have to go through. And there's only so much a president can do to get through that bureaucracy. So it's still, even though the president had this emphasis on developing our American energy, It still takes longer. It's subject to more litigation. There's just more process on federal lands. On the other hand, with the Obama administration, and we're going to see a repeat now under the Biden administration, but probably times 11 is kind of how I like to look at it. You know, it's all dialed up to 11 now with the rhetoric and such, is that President Obama barely tolerated American oil and natural gas. I think ultimately he understood the importance to Americans. People need energy. We don't have an alternative that does everything that oil and natural gas do. But he certainly used certainly did not emphasize oil and natural gas development on public lands. And he put in place more regulation, more process, more red tape. His administration did. And there wasn't that emphasis from the top down to get through some of that red tape. And so things took much longer during the Obama administration. We're now facing a situation with President-elect Biden where there's a specific stated goal of getting rid of leasing and permitting on federal lands. And so not only are they going to throw up those red tape obstacles, but they have specifically come out and said, hey, we want to ban leasing. We want to ban permitting on federal lands. So we're in for a bit of a rough spot with the Biden administration. Now, on the positive side, a president doesn't have that power. Congress has passed many laws governing how we are to develop oil and natural gas on federal lands. And so a president can't just come in and say, I'm not going to lease, I'm not going to permit. If he does, Western Energy Alliance will be in court within hours. We are going to challenge any type of ban like that. But I suspect his administration will be a bit smarter than that. They're not just going to come out and say, hey, we're issuing this presidential order, we're banning new leasing, we're banning permitting, because we would be in court, we would get a preliminary injunction against those bans, and we would ultimately win. So they would never go into effect because they're just not within the power of the president. I can talk through, if you're interested, some of the scenarios that I think will happen to where President Biden will try to achieve that result, perhaps without a presidential order. But that gets maybe into too much of the weeds.
Well, yes and no. And let's let me kind of recap things here. Certainly I'm not in the industry. I follow it very closely with a think tank that looks at New Mexico public policy issues and the reliance the state has on the oil and gas industry, as well as the federal lands here that produce oil and gas. Obama did sign into law, albeit somewhat reluctantly, a elimination of the ban on crude oil exports. And I think that's been one of the great policy successes, quite frankly, of the last decade or so. And our governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, who, while I'm not excited about what she's done as governor, if she had taken the interior slot that she turned down, she had actually voted for that legislation as a standalone bill. Obama didn't sign it until it was folded into a much bigger piece of legislation. Now, Deb Haaland has taken the position of being anti-oil and gas on federal lands. And, Biden has also talked about banning fracking on federal lands, which to my mind is a de facto ban on federal lands drilling for the long term. So I'm glad to hear that he can't just do that. I was not aware of how those regulations were managed, and whether, as the administrator, the president had the ability to put the kibosh on those leases. But I guess it is worth at least a cursory explanation of what he can or cannot do. I'm sure the term slow rolling, or trying to just slowly give these permits is part of the equation here. But if you could maybe go through a few of those concepts with regard to how they might make it more difficult, especially here in New Mexico.
Sure, and you're right about slow rolling. The bureaucracy has a lot of power to just slow things down and drag things out. And when they don't have the will from the top, like they did under the Trump administration, to get on with it, to approve environmental analyses, to approve permits, then things just can grind to almost a halt. So they do have that power of the bureaucracy. And we worked through that under the Obama administration. We can work through that with the Biden administration. But were he to come out and just say, let's take them kind of the two, well, we'll kind of lump them together. But there are things like the Mineral Leasing Act, which is actually the primary law passed by Congress. It's been the law of the land for decades. And it specifies that federal lease sales shall be held quarterly in all states where there is an interest shown. So where states are like New Mexico, where companies are coming in and nominating lands for leasing, the federal government can't just say, oh no, we're not going to lease for 4 years. By the Mineral Leasing Act, they have to move forward with lease sales. So that's where they would run afoul on leasing. When it comes to permitting or banning fracking or banning permits, it's kind of one and the same. If they said, well, okay, we're just not going to approve any permits so that you can move forward and develop on federal lands, they would also run afoul of the Mineral Leasing Act, because a lease is a contract between the federal government and the company, the leaseholder. And if you have a contract, whether it's from 2 years ago or 20 years ago with the federal government, which is what that lease is, then you have to be able, you have a right to move forward with developing that lease under very strict environmental conditions, under a lot of process. It's not just automatic, you can develop anywhere you want, but the federal government can't just come in and say, oh, well, leaseholder, yeah, we sold you that lease a decade ago, but you can't develop on it. That would also run afoul of the Mineral Leasing Act. And again, Western Energy Alliance will be in court challenging, a complete ban on permitting. So they just don't have the law on their side when it comes to just a blanket ban on leasing or development. I have a feeling, because they're getting so much pressure from the left, that they might actually try to do that. But it's actually the easiest scenario for me to deal with, because our organization can just sue under the Mineral Leasing Act. And we've had success with Obama appointed judges and other, Trump and Bush appointed judges. And we would continue to have success with other federal judges as well that might get appointed even by Biden, because the law is really clear that a federal government can't just stop leasing and developing on federal lands.
All right. Well, that gives me some reassurance, and it's good to hear that. Now, before we get to the specifics of the economic impact, because New Mexico does have more energy coming off of federal lands than any other state, as far as I know. Why don't you talk a little bit about Deb Haaland from your knowledge and experience of her? And I'll just say, while my 2 cents is that because President Biden or President-elect Biden put up Michelle Lujan Grisham and then Deb Haaland, both of them are Democrats, females, not just from the West, but from here in New Mexico. Lujan Grisham seems to have a relatively realistic approach to energy, certainly within the context of the Democratic Party. Well, my experience is that Deb Haaland is a very extreme activist with little to no knowledge of energy issues. Are you concerned about her and within the context of the Biden administration, or is it just you were worried about the Biden administration as at the outset? Deb Haaland is just kind of there along for the ride. What's your approach to her?
Well, we were concerned with the Biden administration because before Haaland was nominated, Biden was saying he wanted to ban leasing and development, right? So I think she'll be a loyal soldier in that plan, and she's certainly a true believer. Whereas, as you've pointed out, the governor is much more pragmatic and understands the balance. So one thing that we do know, well, one thing I'm assuming is to some extent, cabinet secretaries in general can be more of figureheads. I think that there will be many very smart people from the Obama administration who will also be in the Interior Department, probably moved up a step, but certainly the second in command and the people who are actually doing the work in the land and minerals section of Interior are going to be smart, savvy people who have been in the Interior Department before. They know the law. They know not just that banning outright is not lawful, but they also are smart at how to use what laws and process they do have and bureaucracy they do have to slow things down. So I think it's going to be really important who the number two and who the actual executioners are, for lack of a better word, for these policies. Because if they come in with a ham-handed, just we're going to do a presidential order and ban all fracking or ban all leasing, I have a pretty easy day in court from that. But if they're going to be more savvy about it, then there are lots of levers at their disposal. And we know how to deal with those as well, but they can certainly slow things down and make federal lands much less competitive. They can kill lots of jobs on federal lands without actually banning fracking or banning permitting and leasing. So I hope I danced around your question and didn't have to enough. But certainly Representative Haaland does not have that public lands experience. She's an important voice for an important constituency in the Interior Department. I mean, the Interior Department has a huge trust responsibility when it comes to Native Americans. So I think it is very important to have that type of voice in leadership at the Interior Department. But when it comes to understanding multiple use on federal lands and energy development and the law surrounding that, I haven't seen that come out of Representative Haaland, even with her work on the Natural Resources Committee. So I would agree with some of your initial setup.
Fair enough. And since you mentioned it, of course, and I agree with you, she is the first Native American head of Interior, to my knowledge, at least. I haven't gone through the entire history books, but certainly in my recent memory, and that is one of many aspects of her job, and certainly managing native lands is a critical thing. And you're not going to find one person who's truly an expert on all those issues. So not, excusing what I'm sure will be many policy disagreements we have, but being realistic and understanding that one person isn't going to know everything about all the different aspects of the Interior Department. But you mentioned native lands, and of course, we have some of the most impoverished people in our country on native lands. One of the things that they do have in many circumstances is access to minerals and oil and gas and other natural resources that they can then sell just like everybody else. Is that something that, of course, it's nearer and dearer to her heart and expertise. What's your take on that issue, just broadly speaking? Do you work in that issue area as an organization?
Absolutely. So yes, there are some major oil and natural gas tribes, including the Navajo Nation, the Jicarilla, the three affiliated tribes up in North Dakota, the Southern Utes in Colorado, the Utes in Utah. And these tribes have significant oil and natural gas and other natural resources. And they want to develop those resources because they are an important source of tribal income. So the Interior Department has the responsibility to develop Indian energy in its trust responsibility for those tribes. Also, the Interior Department has the trust responsibility when it comes to individual Indian mineral owners. And we see this area, we see this particularly around Chaco Canyon and the controversy regarding Chaco Canyon and development in that area up in northwestern New Mexico. And Deb Haaland has proposed basically excluding 10 miles of prime oil and natural gas resources around Chaco Canyon, a radius of 10 miles around Chaco Canyon. And doing so would put off limits the oil and natural gas resources of about 21,000 Navajo owners of those oil and gas resources. So it would take away if she got her way completely, and of course it didn't pass in Congress, but she would take away about $96 million of annual royalties from Navajo Indians if she, just didn't want to develop that oil and natural gas. So it's important to remember that in the Native American community, it's not all, no development. There are many tribes and many individual Indian oil and natural gas owners that want to develop those oil and gas resources. And many of these 21,000 Navajo Olates are very frustrated with Representative Haaland because she has really not listened to them, and she would help remove a major source of income for these individuals to the tune of $96 million a year Navajo Indians get from the royalties on the minerals that they own. So they're very frustrated with her, and she can't just stop that development on tribal lands, certainly, and she can't stop it on federal lands for the laws we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and it is important to note that when it comes to tribes and Native interests, that it's not just keep it in the ground and forget about oil and gas drilling or mineral extraction. It's a lot more nuanced than that. And of course, Deb Haaland went up to Standing Rock and protested against the pipeline up there in North Dakota and all kinds of very activist sort of things. But it's clear that she just has a very strong opinion against oil and gas as an industry and against the whole concept of using those things and drilling for them and mining them. It's not necessarily based on reality, but we'll see when reality hits here, assuming that she is confirmed. Any prospects you expect that she'll be confirmed? I mean, obviously we'll know more when we have a final vote in Georgia in the Senate, but do you expect she will indeed be the Secretary of the Interior?
I do, even if both those Georgia seats go to Republicans. Can I say something about Standing Rock?
Sure.
Just make the point that pipeline was not on the reservation.
Right.
And by the way, the 3 affiliated tribes that, which are tribes I mentioned earlier, they're oil and natural gas tribes in the Bakken of North Dakota. They depend on that pipeline in order to ship their oil to markets so that tribe can earn, their royalties and earn money from that oil. So that's another situation where that activism against oil and natural gas directly hurt a tribe and tribal members.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And yeah, I'm familiar with the location is not on the tribal lands. And that was something that came out in that whole time frame when that was being discussed and the controversy was happening. But of course, it was conveniently ignored by the media. Now, that's a good way to get into the discussion about the study that came out showing the impact of federal drilling bans and potential efforts to restrict oil and gas on federal lands here in New Mexico. So specifically dealing with the state of New Mexico and jobs and economic activity. So your organization wasn't involved in this study or anything, but the study is public information. And why don't you share the details that you have on the study and what it found, and just how critical these resources are that are on federal lands to the state of New Mexico.
Sure, appreciate it. So yeah, that study was very important for providing some good information. So overall, it had a 20-year time frame. It looked at all the major public land states that are responsible for about 98% of federal oil and natural gas development. And it found that overall, our economy in the United States would be $670 billion poorer. So a $670 billion drop in GDP out 40 years. And 351,000 jobs would be lost every year by the year 2040. So a huge economic impact just from taking away development on federal lands. If we look at just the 4 years of the Biden administration, the impact would be $23 billion a year in lost GDP, gross domestic product. And, that at a time when we're, when we're talking about trying to recover from COVID, we're going to drop $23 billion worth of GDP, 22 billion in the state of New Mexico alone. And we're going to kill 36,000 jobs in the state of New Mexico alone over the 4 years of the Biden administration. I mean, that's just terrible for the economy, terrible for the state of New Mexico. That study predicts that lose also in New Mexico tax revenue of $6 billion to the state. I mean, that's a huge portion of New Mexico's budget just by banning development on federal lands. So huge economic impact. I was really glad that the University of Wyoming professor Tim Considine did that study. He did it for the Wyoming Energy Authority. It's kind of like the state energy office in Wyoming. And of course, oil and natural gas is very important to the economy of Wyoming. But that study looked at other states, and just some people just think, well, why not just ban it on federal lands? Well, that's easy to say if you live in San Francisco or New York, but if you are in New Mexico, where schools depend on that revenue, where 36,000 jobs could be lost, I mean, it has a real impact on economic opportunity in the state of New Mexico.
Now, I have a question about the study itself, and hopefully you can answer it because it's not what I think of too technical of a question. It says the state would lose an average of $946 million per year in oil and gas revenue in the first 5 years, tax revenue in the first 5 years under a lease moratorium, and $1.2 billion annually in tax revenue in the first 5 years under a drilling ban. Now, I know those are nuanced differences, but can you explain how a lease moratorium would work versus a drilling ban?
Well, I probably wouldn't have written the study exactly the same way that this professor did, but then again, I'm not an economics professor. So it does get a little confusing because we don't exactly know what the Biden administration is going to do. Are they going to do just a leasing ban? Are they going to do just a drilling ban? Are they going to do some combination? So the numbers I was quoting are for the higher scenario, which would be a leasing and drilling ban, no development on leases. So that's kind of what we looked at, just because the Biden administration has kind of talked about doing both. Obviously, we have to wait until Inauguration Day, and then however long it takes him to get to issuing some kind of ban, or to really know for sure. But this was looking at various scenarios, trying to guess at what he might do and trying to cost. So I hope
Oh,
that.
sure. Yeah. It's just a nuanced set of language for
Right.
somebody even who's a pretty knowledgeable, you know, analyst or follower of these kinds of issues. And really, it is new. It's very interesting language. And, you know, I would encourage folks to check out, you know, the Rio Grande Foundation's got information up, links to the study, links to articles about the study, and it's great information. And you know, your perspective has helped me to at least know that there's not going to be, you know, a ban on oil and gas drilling on New Mexico's federal lands, you know, within 60 days or 30 days of Biden coming into office. He doesn't have that kind of power. So that at least makes me a little happier that we're not going to get washed away here as a state by Biden that quickly. But yeah,
I
any
don't think it's that realistic that he would be able to, but you never know. I mean, you know, there's a risk, right? You don't know what federal judge might just go along with that type. We've seen some very strange rulings out of some judges, and they ultimately get overturned on appeal. But this at least gives policymakers an understanding of what would happen if you did indeed ban development or ban leasing on federal lands. That's the kind of economic impact that could result.
Good to know. Well, Kathleen, we just have a couple minutes left here, and I'm going to ask you to get out your crystal ball and tell us what you see in store for the industry as a whole. Obviously, like we talked about a little bit at the outset, COVID-19 was unprecedented in terms of an interruption to the oil and gas industry, prices going negative for a brief time period. Are you optimistic that we're going to see kind of a strong resurgence tied to growing U.S. economy and getting back to normal in the next year? How do you see, broadly speaking, the future of your industry panning out?
Well, I think we're in for another administration that's trying to look at it as if they can just, by waving their policy wand, get rid of oil and natural gas. But realistically, any real scenario of energy shows that oil and natural gas continues to grow for worldwide as an energy source out to 2050, probably beyond, but that's generally where forecasts go. So we're going to be in for a rough time as the policymakers try to, put in place policies to get rid of us because they just don't like us. But ultimately, there is no alternative. And so we will continue to thrive. It'll be a while before we reach the same level that we were before COVID, just because it's going to take some time for the world economy to get back to where it was before, for people to start traveling again and, returning to normal life. And once they do, we will see demand for oil and natural gas pick up. But we are in for some rough policies for the next couple of years. But ultimately, we've got the law on our side and we've got reality on our side. Americans need reliable and affordable energy. And practical politicians like Governor Grisham and even for that matter, President-elect Biden. I mean, he is a moderate. He does have to appease his left flank, but ultimately he knows if Americans didn't have energy, that he would not be very successful politically.
All right. Well, thank you for your time today, Kathleen. And folks who want to find out more about the Western Energy Alliance can go to westernenergyalliance.org. And I see you guys have a blog and a lot of other great information there. So thanks for your time, Kathleen.
Thanks so much, Paul. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and hopefully 2021 will be a better year for all of us, including the oil and gas industry, than 2020 was. And thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter. And tell Google Home, play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.